So in this video, let's see how we can create the DbContext and put all our entities there, and we'll see if there are any other additional configurations done. So the first thing I would want to do is to create the context file, the root of data folder. I always prefer to have the context outside the entities so it's easily visible for me. So I'll right click and say add new class. I'll give the name as temple context, and since I'm planning to use the features of entity framework, the first thing I will be doing is say using system.data.entity, and with that I will have the DbContext class accessible to me. Let's also make this public. Most of the classes, in fact all of the classes which we are discussing now, whether it is entities, the configurations, the context has to be marked public, otherwise you might not get the expected behavior. Now I've noticed this several times, so just make them public and will not be having any hassles with that. Now what will be the first thing to do? The first thing will be to have a constructor for it, ctor tab, and if you remember, you could call the base constructor by giving the name of the DB we wish to be created in the database. This is optional. If we do not have this constructor, Entity Framework will still go ahead and create the database for us, but it will just take a fully qualified name for the database, which will be a very huge one. So rather we can customize the generated DB name by just passing the name to the base constructor of DbContext. What else we need to do in the context class? We have to make sure that we have a DB set for all the entities which we have, which needs to be virtual. So one of the entities we have is priest, but it's not recognized in this file because of this file being in a different namespace. So I'll just do a control enter, and I'll have the Visual Studio prompt me for fetching the appropriate namespace, and I'll create a property with get and set. This also has to be marked virtual because Entity Framework has to know that this has to be corresponding entities have to be loaded into the DB set in advance, or the lazy loading feature will not work. You can just try removing this virtual probably some other time when you want to really experiment with it. Without the virtual keyword, the entities will not be able to lazy load. Now I would want to do this similar thing for all the entities which are there in our application. So their responsibilities, vehicles, and see they're all in plural form because we are referring to a collection of vehicles. So you can think of this as a data set. If you're familiar with ADO.NET, you can think of this as a table where there will be different rows of vehicles. So that is why we just give a plural name to all these properties. Then comes the interesting part. If you just say override, it will give you all the methods which could be overridden from the DbContext class. Remember, we are inheriting from this. And one method I would want to override now is the onModel creating. So it will complete the things for us. And the first thing I would want to do is to rename this to builder. So it will just be small. Now, why did I override this? Remember, in our entities, we had configurations, and I had told you that these look separate. In fact, these are separate. They seem to be nowhere in line with entity framework, because how will entity framework know how to configure these? So this is the thing. This is how we do. I need to make sure that the entity framework knows about the configurations we want and apply them when the model is being created. That's why we just we are overriding the on model creating, so we can ask entity framework and tell them that, look, I have a certain way of configuring my entities, and you would want to keep that in mind. So let's go ahead and copy this class name and go to our context file. And say builder dot configurations dot add distribution detail configuration. So we are just creating an object on the fly of the configuration class and supplying it to builder. So entity framework now knows that when it is creating the model, it needs to adhere to the configuration we have supplied there. So similarly, we might want to do it for other configurations which we have. So let me just copy paste this. Remember, we have a priest configuration as well. Which is called priest config, and call it as well. So this is how we wire up the configuration classes in the on model creating. So now that we have our context ready, in the next video we'll just go ahead and create an application, or rather a user interface for this application, and see how the database is generated by the entity framework using our temple context and configurations.